This is Washington Watch. I'm your host, Tony Perkins, joined today by Meg Kilgannon, my co-host. Well, how is it in the co-host seat over there?
It's exciting.
Yeah.
It's fun to be here.
Yeah, as long as we keep everything, like in the planes, you just keep the right side up.
Yes.
So, all right, we're right side up.
So,
lot happening here in Washington, D.C. this week. Actually, a lot happening across around the world. In particular, we haven't had a chance to focus heavily on it, but the issue of Cuba and what is happening there. My hope is to turn to that Monday. But one of the things I've been monitoring is I've been getting reports that there have been religious leaders that have been abducted in some cases, others fearful about what is unfolding there. President Biden, quite frankly, the administration, I would have thought would have spoken out on this. They've been avoiding it, but finally yesterday, President Biden made at least a passing statement when he was asked a question. Here's what he had to say.
Communism is a failed system, universally failed system. And I don't see socialism as a very useful substitute, but that's another story.
Yeah, that is another story, and I'm sure we're going to have plenty of opportunities to talk about that. But speaking of the religious aspects of this, we often see religious leaders targeted, and that was something that was talked about quite prominently this week at the International Religious Freedom Summit here in Washington, D.C.
Religious leaders are often targeted, but also they are tremendous signs of hope in countries that are oppressed.
That's why they take them out.
And exactly. And so we've seen footage of people gathering around churches and demanding their religious freedom, and we need to, as Americans, really appreciate the blessing that we have here with our religious liberties and seek that for others.
That's right, and that was a prominent theme this week at the International Religious Freedom Summit that ended last night. Joining us now to talk more about that is Vice President of Policy and Government Affairs here at the Family Research Council and the Director of our Center for Religious Liberty. He wears a lot of hats. Travis Weber. Travis, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Thank you.
Let's start there, but there's a lot to unpack for this week, and I want to give people some action items, inform them, but what steps they need to be taking, because there's some things that happened yesterday they need to know about and act upon. But let's start there with the International Religious Freedom Summit. Your sense of how that went?
Yeah, Tony, I think it went really well. We heard a lot over the past few days from activists, victims, leaders. Specifically, China was a big point of focus, obviously, Nigeria as well, and other issues across the African continent. That was the subject of FRC's side event panel that we hosted on Wednesday. Yesterday, our lunch focused on China, and we heard from Senator Josh Hawley and Tom Cotton, as well as Grace Gao, whose father is imprisoned in China, a Christian human rights attorney, imprisoned for his opposition to the regime and speaking up for the defenseless. She hasn't heard from him in 4 years. And so these are really important stories to be able to bring out so people understand the personal impact of the issue and continue to advocate for religious freedom by letting their elected officials know this is an important issue to them and other Americans, and they want our leaders to act on it.
I would say probably a prominent theme that was throughout the summit was that, as Meg was saying a minute ago, we have religious freedom here in the United States, and we have freedom of speech, and we have a responsibility to utilize that to the benefit of others.
Absolutely. And Tony, this is something that we've talked about. Andrew Brunson, who's a special advisor on this issue to FRC, has mentioned this, and you heard it at the summit. Ambassador Brownback, other leaders that I've been in conversations with privately have expressed this. I think we're seeing a renewed interest in addressing the issues domestically because many are recognizing. I know of activists and advocates who have exclusively worked on international religious freedom, who are now within the last 2 years looking at domestic religious liberty, realizing we need to turn our eyes to this because if we don't protect it here, we're not going to even have a platform to advocate for it internationally. So I think this is a theme of the summit. We heard it from multiple quarters. It's something that's being talked about more and more privately And I think we're seeing a lot more interest in this because, yeah, as you said, without protections for it here, we're going to be at a loss for being able to advocate around the world.
Well, let's move now domestically because a lot happened on Capitol Hill this week. In particular, for the first time since 1993, coming out of the Appropriations Committee was a labor appropriations bill that did not contain the Hyde language. And we got to go back to the Bill Clinton time when that came out of committee. Of course, it didn't survive that on the floor. The language was put on. It's been there since 1976. I mean, we're at a very significant turning point in history.
We are, and it's important that people understand that Democrats are making a very concerted effort to remove Hyde protections, force taxpayers to fund abortions, and basically get more aggressive with their abortion advocacy, all at a time when the trends for life across America are going in the opposite direction. More Americans are pro-life. We're seeing that reflected in politics. We're seeing more bills protecting life at the state level, more leaders willing to protect life. Yesterday in the House Appropriations Committee hearing markup on the labor HHS bill which is the bill that you referenced as lacking the Hyde protections at this point. You had almost all Republicans throughout the course of the day standing up in defense of Hyde. Andy Harris from Maryland, but many others joining him in defending the need for Hyde. Rosa DeLauro, top Democrat, so frustrated by this, she had to come in after this and basically kind of argue for why she thinks Hyde needs to be stripped and argue for her pro-abortion extremism because she was so caught off guard by the momentum on the life side from Republicans. We know Leader McConnell put out a statement yesterday and made remarks on this. So I think what we're seeing is trends going in favor of life. The Supreme Court taking up the Dobbs case, hopefully going to give us a ruling. Many state bills being introduced, hundreds of state bills on the life question. And at the same time, Democrats digging in their heels. And this is reflected in this bill coming out of committee yesterday. It's going to move through the House, along with other appropriations measures, which FRC is tracking and working on cutting the provisions from them to the degree we can that harm life, harm the family, and harm freedom. And so this is an important milestone for people to be aware of. We're not going to stop and have to continue to handle this in Congress as best we can.
Well, that's one of the really wonderful things about working at Family Research Council is the just profound commitment to life that's in the organization and the work that you do to keep members of Congress informed. And there's a new resource that we have on fetal dignity. Can you tell our listeners about that?
Yes, this is a resource, as you mentioned, fetal dignity. So what is fetal dignity? It's basically the area of pro-life advocacy that says how do we care for the dignity of the unborn. One area is proper care for fetal remains. We've seen this issue become a problem when there's the discussion over the provision of baby body parts to Planned Parenthood. We all know about the David and the Leiden videos that came to light a few years ago. Dr. Klopfer in Illinois storing the fetal remains in his garage. I mean, these horrific, grotesque examples of the violation of the dignity of the unborn. So legislatures, and they have been moving at the states, a number of states have protected fetal remains. It's an important area that we need to continue to advocate for. There's bills moving on the Hill in this, and people need to know about this, understand the ethics of fetal tissue research, proper care for fetal remains. That's all in this issue brief, which we have up on our website, and among other pro-life resources is available at frc.org/life.
Travis, let me go back to the Hyde Amendment for just a moment because I want people to understand the significance of this moment. Since 1976, Henry Hyde, former congressman from Illinois, now deceased, he brought this forward. This has been middle ground in which people who were okay with abortion, those who were not, all agreed that no one should be forced to pay for it. And so that's been bipartisan. Even President Biden supported that position over and over and over again because it's an annual rider that has been routinely voted on. This is the first time it looks like it's going to be advanced. It is not in the president's budget. There's also conscience protections for medical workers. That's not in the president's budget. So these policy riders that are attached to these spending bills, that's just the way it works here in Washington, D.C., are not there. So people can weigh in on that. They can go to frc.org/SaveHyde and register their concerns with their members of Congress. How important is it that they do that?
It's very important, Tony, because as you say, we've been in these fights year in and year out. Usually the status quo is acceptable in some capacity with some polishing around the edges. The status quo, though, is that these riders are in these bills, and that means no taxpayer funding for abortion. Dems are trying to up the ante on that this year and remove Hyde, among other revisions to this bill and other appropriations bills. So, we look back over years and years of accepting a sort of truce of sorts, a truce, I want to say of sorts, because they will the Democrats will try to get aggressive around the edges. This is a full frontal attack on life, forcing taxpayers to fund it. People need to weigh in, and they can do so, as you mentioned. We can go to frcaction.org/SaveHyde, and that will bring them to a page where they can easily communicate with their elected officials and let them know where they stand on life and that taxpayers should not be forced to fund abortion.
This is a fundamental change from, I'm old enough to remember when Democrats used to say things like abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, right? They weren't necessarily advocating openly for abortion rights or abortion on demand without apology or shouting their abortions like we hear activists doing today. This is a huge change in our culture that I think is represented by their willingness to abandon Hyde.
It is. There's a couple of things at play here I think people need to understand. One, some would say, well, you got Nancy Pelosi in charge of the House. The Democrats have the majority. You got Joe Biden in the White House. This is going to go through. No, not really. Now, it will probably go through the House. The vote's going to take place in the House week after next. But that doesn't matter. Whether or not it's going to happen does not matter, should not dictate what we do. We need to make sure that the elected officials, whether they're going to support Hyde or not, know that this is important. Yes. The majority, almost 6 out of every 10 Americans agree we should not be forced to fund abortions. So they need to hear that, and this is important even for those who defend the Hyde Amendment, these protections, so that they know when they're in the majority that this is something that is expected of them.
Yes.
But I'm old enough, Meg. I've been in this political process long enough, for a quarter of a century. I've been in the political process. That sounds like a long time. But I remember when the life issue was contentious among the ranks of Republicans.
Right.
And so I bring that point forward just to say that we've made tremendous progress over the years to where there's now not a single open pro-choice Republican in the House of Representatives. They're not there.
Yes.
We've made tremendous, and as you talked, Travis, about the Dobbs case. That is soon to be before the Supreme Court. They're going to have the oral arguments, probably the decision next year. That could essentially send this whole issue of abortion back to the states, and then we'll have probably 3/4 of the states be pro-life, and you'll have a few on the edges that will continue in this pro-abortion, and people will move and vote with their feet. I think we're seeing a huge shift taking place, and it's because of the faithfulness and the determination that people have had over the years. Now is not the time to back up or give up.
No, fully agree. And if you look at the Dobbs, we're involved in discussions on the brief in question right now. We're going to be filing an amicus brief in that case, and you're seeing a lot of energy about the opportunity to protect life and roll back abortion with this Supreme Court case. That, as you noted, being reflected in the states when they're given opportunities to actually pass these pro-life laws. I mean, we're seeing pro-life laws advance in the states and being passed into law now. You look at the full abortion bans, most recently in Arkansas, that protect life at all stages. And people and their elected leaders are fed up with waiting and being mealy-mouthed about protecting life. We need to protect it. They're doing that, and they're not waiting for the courts to come along. They're showing where the voice of the people is. Either we're going to continue to see this, and we're going to continue to see it as we look towards the Dobbs decision, and given the pro-life momentum that's driving things around the country.
Well, Travis, thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate all that you and your team do on Capitol Hill. It's been a busy week, but guess what? Next week will be busy too.
It'll be busy. Thank you.
All right.